My name is Eleanor, and for most of my life, I believed that if you loved your children enough, gave them enough, sacrificed enough, they would love you back the same way when it mattered. I don't believe that anymore, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I was 31 when my husband Frank died. A heart attack sudden on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of day where nothing is supposed to happen. I had 3 children then. Daniel was 9, Susan was 6, and Michael was just 2 years old, still needing to be carried up the stairs at night. I remember standing in the kitchen the morning after the funeral, looking at the mortgage papers on the table, and understanding that I was now the only thing standing between my children and the street. So I worked. I took a job at the textile mill on the edge of town, and later, when my hands got too tired for that kind of work, I did alterations out of the house, hemmed zippers, wedding dresses for other people's daughters. I made every dollar count twice. I canned vegetables from a garden the size of a bedsheet. I sewed my daughter's Easter dress out of a curtain nobody wanted anymore, and I never told her that, not once, not even when she was grown. The house on Larkspur Street was the one thing I gave myself. Frank and I had bought it 2 years before he passed, a small white house with green shutters and a porch that caught the morning sun just right. After he died, I could have sold it. People told me a widow with 3 children doesn't need 4 bedrooms, they said. But I stayed. I paid it down month by month for 31 years until the day came when I held the paid-off deed in my hands and cried at the kitchen table alone, because there was no one left who understood what that piece of paper meant to me. I raised my children in that house. I nursed Daniel through pneumonia in the back bedroom. I taught Susan to ride a bicycle in the driveway, running alongside her until my lungs burned. I hung Michael's college acceptance letter on the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a strawberry, and I kept it there for 11 years after he left, because I liked seeing it when I made my coffee in the morning. They grew up. They moved away the way children do, the way I always told myself was right and natural and nothing to grieve over. Daniel became an accountant in the city, married a woman named Patricia, who wore her opinions like jewelry, loud and polished and always on display. Susan moved out west and called twice a year, usually around a holiday, in a voice that always sounded like she was checking a box. Michael stayed closest geographically, but somehow felt the farthest away, swallowed up by a job that kept him traveling most months of the year. I didn't complain. A mother doesn't get to complain about the shape her children's love takes. You take what they give you, and you call it enough, because the alternative is admitting that maybe it isn't enough. And then, what do you do with that? I was 72 when the trouble in my hip started. Nothing dramatic, just enough that stairs became a project instead of a thoughtless act, just enough that Daniel and Patricia started using words like concerned and for your own good on their increasingly rare visits. I noticed, but I didn't think much of it. I thought concern was still love, wearing a different coat. It was Patricia who first mentioned the accounts. Eleanor, with your hip the way it is, it's just easier if Daniel helps manage things for now. Just the paperwork. Just so nothing falls through the cracks. I remember nodding along because it did sound sensible, because I trusted my son, because 30 years of being the one who managed everything alone had left me tired in a way I didn't fully admit to myself. Daniel came by more often after that. Not to sit with me, not to ask about my garden or my aching hip or the book I was reading, but to go through drawers, bank statements, the deed, a folder I kept in the hall closet, labeled in my own careful handwriting. Important Frank and Eleanor. I watched him flip through it at my kitchen table one Sunday afternoon, Patricia hovering behind him with her arms crossed, and something small and cold moved through my chest that I didn't have a name for yet. "Just being thorough, Mom," he said without looking up. I should have asked more questions. I know that now, but I had spent 41 years being the person who solved problems for everyone else, and some old habit in me still wanted to believe that my son solving problems for me was a kind of gift being given back, rather than something being quietly taken. The morning it happened, I was in the kitchen making tea, the same kitchen where I'd once cried over a paid-off deed, and Daniel and Patricia came in without calling first. Susan was on the phone, on speaker, her voice tinny and rehearsed, and Daniel said the sentence that would end one version of my life, and though none of us knew it, yet begin another. "Mom, we found a place for you. Willow Creek. It's already arranged. We think it's best if you move next week." I stood there with the kettle in my hand, and I asked the only question that seemed to matter. "Arranged by who?" Nobody answered me directly. Patricia said something about liability, about the stairs, about how a house this size was impractical for someone in my condition. Susan's voice on the speakerphone said, "We just want you safe, Mom," in the tone of someone reading from a script she hadn't written herself. I looked at the three of them, two in the room, one disembodied and distant on a phone screen, and I understood with a clarity that frightened me that this decision had already been made somewhere I hadn't been invited. The house I had bled for the porch that caught the morning sun, the refrigerator that still even then held the ghost shape of a strawberry magnet, all of it had already been discussed, decided, arranged, without so much as a phone call to the woman who owned every square inch of it. I set the kettle down very carefully because my hands had started to shake, and I said, "I see." That was all I said. I see. 2 words. But inside me, something that had been sleeping for a very long time. Something patient. Something that remembered every ledger I'd ever balanced, every dollar I'd ever stretched, every quiet insult I'd swallowed for the sake of peace. That something opened one eye and began very slowly to wake up. The week between that kitchen conversation and the move to Willow Creek passed the way water moves over stones, smooth on the surface, relentless underneath. Daniel called it getting things in order. Patricia called it making the transition easier. I called it privately being handled. There were papers. So many papers. They arrived in manila folders that Daniel would set on my kitchen table with a pen already clipped to the top, and he'd say in the breezy tone of a man reading a weather report, "Just sign where the tabs are." "Mom, it's all standard stuff. Intake forms for the home, and this one's just giving me temporary authority to help manage the accounts while you get settled." Temporary. That word did a lot of work in that sentence, and I let it. I want to be honest with you about why I signed. It wasn't because I was foolish, and it wasn't because I didn't notice the way Patricia stood just behind Daniel's shoulder, watching my pen move across each page like she was counting something. I signed because I was 72 years old, and my hip ached, and I had just been told without being asked that my life, as I knew it, was ending in 7 days. And there is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from realizing that the people who are supposed to protect you have already decided quietly and efficiently what is going to happen to you. Fighting takes energy, and for 1 week, I didn't have it to spare. But I want you to remember one thing, because it will matter later. I had already been to my bank alone, 3 months before any of this began. My hip had been bothering me since spring, and some old instinct, the same instinct that had kept a widow and 3 children fed for 40 years, told me to be careful. I had gone to see Mr. Alvarez, who had managed my late husband's small pension account since before Daniel could walk, and I had made a decision that day that I told no one about. Not Daniel, not Patricia, not even Susan 3 time zones away with her twice-a-year phone calls. I'll tell you what that decision was later, because right now, sitting in that kitchen, signing papers with tabs on them, even I didn't know how important it would turn out to be. I only knew that some part of me had months earlier quietly refused to leave everything in my children's hands. Call it a mother's instinct. Call it 31 years of solving problems alone. I call it the only smart thing I did in that entire terrible year. The morning I left Larkspur Street, I was allowed to pack 2 suitcases. 2. For a house I had lived in for over 3 decades. Patricia stood in the doorway of my bedroom while I folded cardigans I had knitted myself, and she said not unkindly, but not kindly either, "You really don't need much there, Eleanor. It's all provided." I did not cry in front of her. I want you to know that. I folded my cardigans, and I packed a small framed photograph of Frank from our wedding day. And I took, without asking anyone's permission, the manila folder from the hall closet, labeled Important Frank and Eleanor, the one Daniel had gone through months before. I don't think anyone noticed it was missing until much later, and by then, it didn't matter anymore. Willow Creek Care Home smelled like antiseptic and canned green beans, and my room was the size of my old pantry. There was a single window that looked out onto a parking lot. Not a garden, not a porch, just rows of cars glinting in whatever sun managed to reach them. I sat on the narrow bed the first night with my 2 suitcases at my feet, and for the first time since Frank died, I let myself feel the full, crushing weight of being alone. That's where I met Martin. He was 81, a retired high school shop teacher, sharp-eyed in a way that the staff at Willow Creek seemed to consistently underestimate. He knocked on my open door the second morning, holding 2 cups of the terrible coffee they served in the dining hall, and said, "You looked like you needed this more than I did, and I looked like I needed an excuse to talk to somebody new." Seemed efficient to combine the two. I laughed for the first time in a week. It surprised me how much I needed that. Martin had been at Willow Creek for 4 years. His own son lived 2 hours away and visited, he told me, without bitterness, about as often as the seasons change. He had made peace with it in a way I hadn't yet, and would spend the next 3 years slowly teaching me how. It was Martin who first said the words that I would turn over and over in my mind for the rest of my time there. We were sitting in the little common room, watching Patricia's number flash on my phone screen, a call I had let ring out unanswered for the 3rd time that week, and Martin said without looking up from his crossword puzzle, "You know, Eleanor, there's a particular kind of person who visits often when there's something to take, and stops visiting the moment there's nothing left to get. It's not cruelty exactly. It's just arithmetic to them, but arithmetic runs both ways if you're patient enough." I didn't fully understand what he meant that day. I understand it perfectly now. 3 weeks after I arrived, the phone rang, and this time I answered it. It was Daniel, and his voice had a briskness to it that I recognized from childhood, the tone he used right before delivering news he'd already decided I couldn't argue with. "Mom, we've had some interest in the house. A young couple, good offer cash even. Patricia thinks we should move on it before the market shifts." I remember looking out my small window at the parking lot at a woman loading grocery bags into the trunk of a blue sedan. Ordinary life happening in a place that had nothing to do with me anymore, and I said the only thing I had left to say. "Do what you think is best, Daniel." I want you to notice something about that sentence. It sounds like surrender. It wasn't. It was the sound of a woman deciding to stop spending her energy on battles she had already 3 months earlier and without telling anyone quietly made unwinnable for the people trying to fight them. I found out the house had actually sold not from my son, not from Patricia, not even from a phone call meant to inform me, but from a letter. Mrs. Donahue, who had lived 2 doors down from me on Larkspur Street for 26 years, who had brought me casseroles the week Frank died, and never once in all that time forgotten my birthday, wrote to me at Willow Creek in her looping, old-fashioned handwriting. She said she'd seen the moving truck. She said she hoped I was doing all right wherever they'd taken me. She said, almost as an afterthought, that the new family seemed nice enough, that they'd already repainted the shutters, a color she didn't care for some fashionable gray, instead of the green Frank had chosen the year we bought the place. I read that letter 3 times in my narrow bed at Willow Creek, and on the 3rd reading, something in my chest simply gave way. Not loudly, not with the kind of grief that announces itself. It was quieter than that, the grief of realizing that the last physical place where your husband's hands had touched something, where your children's height marks were still penciled onto a closet doorframe, where a strawberry magnet had held up a college acceptance letter for 11 years, after the boy who received it stopped needing his mother's kitchen, that all of it now belonged to strangers who didn't like the color green. Daniel called 2 days later, and I asked him as calmly as I could manage why I had learned about the sale from a neighbor instead of my own son. "We didn't want to overwhelm you, Mom. You've had a lot of changes lately. We handled the details so you wouldn't have to worry." Handled? Another word doing a great deal of work. I asked what had happened to the proceeds. A fair question, I thought, from a woman who had built that equity dollar by dollar over 3 decades of alterations and canned vegetables and hemming other women's wedding dresses. There was a pause on the line, the particular kind of pause that tells you someone is choosing their words with more care than the situation on its face should require. "It's in an account Patricia and I are managing," Daniel said finally. "For your care, Willow Creek isn't cheap, Mom, and we want to make sure everything's covered long term. It's complicated, but we've got it handled." There was that word again. Patricia called a week after that, and her tone had shifted from the careful gentleness of the early days into something more impatient, more transactional, the tone of a woman who has decided that a difficult conversation is now behind her and doesn't understand why the other party hasn't caught up. "Eleanor, I know it's hard to hear, but honestly, the house sitting there empty just didn't make sense. You weren't using it. It was just sitting there, depreciating while you were here. Safe, being taken care of. We did the responsible thing. You weren't using it. As if a home is only a home while someone is standing inside it. As if 31 years of mortgage payments evaporate the moment illness moves a woman 2 miles away into a room with a parking lot view." I didn't argue with her. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't grace and it wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It was that I had already 3 months before any of this, quietly at my own bank with Mr. Alvarez, telling no one made a decision about exactly this kind of moment. I didn't know, sitting in my narrow bed with Mrs. Donahue's letter in my lap, precisely how it would play out. But I knew in the deepest part of myself that the account Daniel and Patricia believed they were managing was not the whole picture. It was not even the important part of the picture. And there is a particular kind of peace that settles over you when you understand that the people trying to take something from you have no idea how much of it was never actually there for the taking. Martin found me crying in the common room that evening, quietly the way I'd learned to do everything at Willow Creek quietly, so as not to trouble the staff or draw attention I didn't want. He didn't ask what was wrong. He'd been there long enough to know. He simply sat down across from me with 2 cups of the bad coffee and said, "Grief doesn't need company to be real, Eleanor, but it's easier to carry when somebody's willing to sit with you while you carry it." I told him about the house that night, the green shutters now painted gray, the closet doorframe with our children's heights penciled into the wood, likely painted over by now, or simply not noticed at all by people who had no reason to look for it. Martin listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he said something I've carried with me since. "You know, my late wife used to say that houses are just wood and nails until you fill them with people who love each other. Once the people are gone or scattered, the house is just a house again. What your children took wasn't the house, Eleanor. It was the version of themselves that used to live in it, the versions that deserved it. That's a heavier thing to lose if you ask me, and I don't think they've realized it yet. I didn't fully understand that either, not that night. I understand it now. I understand it very well. Time moves strangely in a place like Willow Creek. The days blur into a rhythm of meals and medication carts, and the particular quality of afternoon light through institutional windows. But the years pass, with a stillness that surprises you looking back. 3 years went by that way. Daniel visited exactly 4 times in those 3 years. Patricia came twice, always with him, always for less than an hour, always with a reason to leave early that arrived precisely at the 45-minute mark, like clockwork. Susan sent a card at Christmas each year signed with her name and nothing else. No note, no questions about how I was no acknowledgement that a woman living in a single room with a parking lot view might have something to say if anyone thought to ask. Michael called more often than the others, to his credit, though the calls grew shorter. Each year filled out increasingly with apologies for calls that would come later and somehow never did. I want to tell you honestly that I spent a great deal of those 3 years being sad. I am not interested in performing a stronger version of myself than the one who actually lived through those days. There were nights I lay in that narrow bed and grieved so completely for Frank, for the house, for the children I had raised, who had somehow become people I barely recognized, that I couldn't have told you in the morning whether I'd slept at all. But I want to tell you about the other thing, too. The thing that grew alongside the grief, quietly, the way certain plants root themselves in soil, nobody thought to check. Martin and I became, in the plainest and most necessary sense, family. We ate breakfast together every morning, at the same corner table by the window that didn't look out on the parking lot, A small victory negotiated over months with a nurse named Deborah, who had a soft spot for the two of us and quietly rearranged the seating chart on our behalf. We did crossword puzzles. He taught me to play gin rummy, badly at first, and then well enough to beat him 3 times out of 5, which he never once let me forget. We talked about our marriages, our children, our griefs, our small joys, the taste of good coffee, the particular blue of the sky through that reclaimed window in early autumn, the strange comfort of being known fully and without performance by another person, late in life when you had assumed that kind of knowing was behind you. I kept a manila folder in my nightstand drawer. It was the one I had taken from the hall closet the morning I left Larkspur Street. Important Frank and Eleanor, and inside it, alongside old insurance papers and Frank's discharge certificate from the Army, I kept a single document I had brought back from my visit to Mr. Alvarez 3 months before my children ever mentioned the word arranged. I read it sometimes on the hardest nights, not because I needed to remind myself of the details which I knew by heart, but because holding it reminded me of something important, that I had not in fact been as powerless in that terrible year as my children believed. That somewhere in the exhaustion and grief of losing my home and my independence, some old stubborn part of me had still managed to protect one thing quietly without asking permission from anyone. I never told Martin the specifics. I want to be honest about that too. It wasn't distrust, not by that point. It was something closer to superstition, the kind that makes you afraid to say a good thing out loud in case saying it undoes it. But I told him one evening in the 3rd year that I had taken care of something before I left my house, and that one day I believed my children were going to learn exactly what that meant, and it was not going to be the day or in the way they expected. Martin set down his crossword puzzle and looked at me for a long moment. "Eleanor," he said, "I have known a great many people in my 84 years, and I have learned that the quiet ones are almost always the ones you should be careful not to underestimate. I have a feeling your children are about to learn that lesson the hard way." He was right, though. Even he didn't know how right or how soon. The letters from the bank had started arriving at Willow Creek about 18 months into my stay, addressed to me, not to Daniel, which struck the front desk staff as unusual enough that they mentioned it to me directly, rather than simply forwarding them along to the authorized contact listed on my intake forms. I read each one carefully in my room alone, and each time I felt that same old sensation return, the sleeping thing from the kitchen on Larkspur Street, opening its eye a little further. I won't tell you yet exactly what those letters said. I'll only tell you this 3 months before my children arranged for me to be moved to Willow Creek. I had walked into my bank alone with my aching hip and my careful handwriting, and I had made a decision about the eventual sale of my house that neither of them knew existed. A provision, a trust, a clause with a very specific, very deliberate number of years, attached to it a number I chose myself, sitting across from Mr. Alvarez, for reasons that made perfect sense to me, and to no one else, because no one else knew. 3 years, that was the number. And in the spring of the 3rd year, almost to the week, the bank's letters stopped being addressed only to me. I learned about the phone call the same way I'd learned about the house sale, after the fact secondhand, though this time the messenger was Deborah, the nurse, who had rearranged the breakfast seating chart on my behalf, and who had over 3 years become something like a friend. "Eleanor," she said, appearing in my doorway one Tuesday afternoon with an expression I hadn't seen on her before, a kind of barely contained curiosity. "Your son called the front desk this morning. Twice. He wants to know if he can bring your daughter-in-law and come see you this weekend." He sounded rattled. I set down the book I'd been reading. One Martin had lent me, a mystery novel with a plot considerably less interesting than the one currently unfolding in my own life, and I asked as evenly as I could, "Did he say why?" "No," Deborah said. "But he asked something odd. He asked whether the home had received any correspondence from a bank regarding your accounts." I told him I couldn't discuss financial matters, obviously, but Eleanor, he sounded worried. Genuinely worried, not the usual kind of call we get. I thanked her, and after she left, I sat very still for a long moment, and then I did something I hadn't done in longer than I could remember. I laughed quietly alone in my small room, with its view of the parking lot. A real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and old and long buried. I knew exactly what had happened, or near enough. 3 years earlier, sitting across from Mr. Alvarez, I had arranged for the proceeds of my house, the actual proceeds, not the modest care account Daniel and Patricia had quietly funneled a fraction of the sale into, and believed was the whole of it, to be placed into an irrevocable trust, in my name alone, structured with a specific triggering condition: a full accounting and disclosure notice sent by the bank to every listed party. On the 3rd anniversary of the trust's funding, informing all relevant parties of the trust's existence, its terms. And this was the detail that mattered most: the fact that any funds Daniel and Patricia believed they had managed from a separate account were and had always been a small fraction diverted from a much larger sum that neither of them had ever had legal authority over, despite what they believed the power of attorney I signed under duress had granted them. I had structured it that way deliberately. I hadn't known that day in Mr. Alvarez's office exactly what my children would do, or exactly when they would do it. I only knew with the particular clarity that comes from raising 3 children and watching slowly which ones would show up when there was nothing to gain, and which ones would show up only when there was. I only knew that I needed something protected, something that would eventually force a reckoning on its own schedule, without requiring me to have the strength, in whatever state I might be in 3 years later, to fight for it myself. The bank's notice, it turned out, had gone not just to me, but to Daniel as co-signatory on the smaller account. He believed was the entirety of what remained of my house, because the trust's terms required disclosure to any party who had exercised financial authority on my behalf during the relevant period. In plain terms, the moment that letter arrived at Daniel's house, he learned 2 things simultaneously. First, that a trust existed containing a sum considerably larger than anything he and Patricia had spent down over 3 years of managing my care. And second, that the funds inside it were per the trust's own terms entirely and irrevocably outside his reach, protected, structured, and controlled by provisions that a 72-year-old widow had quietly arranged in a bank office 3 months before her own children decided without consulting her, where she would spend the remainder of her life. They arrived at Willow Creek that Saturday. I watched them come across the parking lot from my window, the same parking lot I had grieved looking at for 3 years. And something in me went very calm, the way the surface of a lake goes calm, right before a change in weather that only the birds seem to sense in advance. Daniel hugged me first. A hug that lasted a beat too long, the kind of hug that is trying to communicate something the person giving it hasn't found words for yet. Patricia's smile was bright and brittle, the kind you'd see on a saleswoman closing a difficult account. "Eleanor, you look wonderful. We've missed you so much. We should have come more. We know that we've just been so busy." "How is the house?" I asked, watching her face carefully. "The new owners, do they still have it painted, that gray, or have they changed it again?" Something flickered behind Patricia's eyes, quick and unmistakable, and I understood in that instant that she had come to Willow Creek with a plan for how this conversation would go, and my question had already knocked the first stone loose from that plane's foundation. "We actually wanted to talk to you about something," Daniel said, guiding me gently toward the small sitting area near my room, the same chairs where Martin and I did our crossword puzzles most mornings. "Some financial paperwork's come up, a little confusing, honestly. We were hoping you could help us understand it." I sat down slowly, the way I had learned to move in a body that had aged 3 more years since I last saw them, and I folded my hands in my lap. And I said, in the calmest voice I had used with either of them in longer than I could remember, "Of course, Daniel. I'd be happy to explain. I want you to picture the scene the way I saw it, because I've replayed it in my mind 1,000 times since, and each time I find some new detail, I'm grateful I noticed." Daniel had brought the letter with him, the bank's notice, folded into careful thirds, the paper already soft at the creases from being read and reread on the drive over. Patricia sat beside him with her purse in her lap, both hands wrapped around the strap, the way people hold on to things when they've stopped trusting the ground beneath them. Poor Mom, Daniel said, unfolding the letter with hands that weren't quite steady. This says there's a trust, in your name. With Mom, this is a lot of money. More than the house sold for once, you account for how the funds were invested. We had no idea this existed. No, I said. I imagine you didn't. We don't understand, Patricia said, and for the first time in 3 years, her voice had lost the polish it usually carried. The careful confidence that had once told me a house just sitting there made no sense. The account we've been managing for your care, the money from the house, it's almost gone. We used it for Willow Creek, for your things, for... She stopped herself, perhaps hearing for the first time how that sentence sounded out loud. For your things, I repeated gently. I see. I let the silence sit for a moment before I continued, because I had waited 3 years for this conversation, and I found somewhat to my own surprise that I was in no hurry to rush through it. 3 months before you told me Willow Creek had already been arranged, I said. I went to see Mr. Alvarez at the bank. My hip had been bothering me since spring, and something told me call it a mother's instinct, or maybe just 40 years of managing a household alone, that I should be careful with what I had left. So I moved the equity from Larkspur Street once it eventually sold into a trust in my name. Not yours, Daniel. Not yours, Patricia. Mine. With a provision that would notify all involved parties of its existence and terms after 3 years, whether or not I was still capable of explaining it myself. Daniel's face had gone pale, in a way I hadn't seen since he was 9 years old, standing in the doorway of our house on the morning his father's casket was lowered into the ground. Mom, why would you? We thought we were helping. You thought the house was yours to sell the moment it was inconvenient for me to be living in it? I said, still gently, because I had promised myself in the quiet of 1,000 nights at Willow Creek that when this moment finally came, I would not become the kind of woman who needed to raise her voice to be believed. You thought a power of attorney, signed by a grieving, exhausted 72-year-old woman 1 week before her forced move, meant you had authority over everything she'd built in 31 years, rather than temporary help with the paperwork. She genuinely couldn't manage alone that particular week. Those are two very different things, Daniel, and I think, somewhere underneath all your explanations, you've always known that. Patricia's hands had tightened around her purse strap until her knuckles had gone white. Eleanor, the money in that trust is there anyway. No, I said, and for the first time there was something in my voice that was not gentle at all, something that had been waiting patiently for 3 years to finally be spoken aloud. There is no way. That's the entire point of a trust, Patricia. It's irrevocable. I made sure of that, specifically sitting in Mr. Alvarez's office, because I understood even then, even before you'd said a single word about Willow Creek, exactly what kind of help I could expect from the two of you once there was nothing left in it for you to manage. Daniel put his head in his hands, and for a moment I almost felt the old instinct rise up in me, the one that had spent 40 years smoothing over hard moments for my children, protecting them from the full weight of consequences they'd earned. I let the instinct pass through me, and out the other side the way you let a wave pass over you at the shore without being knocked down by it. What happens to it now? He asked quietly, not looking up. The money in the trust? It stays exactly where it is, I said, growing modestly under Mr. Alvarez's management, exactly as I arranged it. When I die, it goes to my grandchildren directly, not to you, not to Patricia, not to Susan, not even to Michael, though he at least called more than either of you managed to, directly to the next generation, structured so that none of you can touch it, manage it, or spend it down on my behalf ever again. I made that decision 3 years ago in a bank office, with nobody's help and nobody's permission on a day. None of you thought to ask me how I was feeling. I want to tell you that the silence after I said that was heavy with the kind of consequence I'd imagined for 3 years. It was. But it was also strangely peaceful. The particular peace that comes not from anger finally being spoken, but from the simple, quiet relief of no longer having to carry a secret alone. Daniel and Patricia left Willow Creek less than an hour later. I watched them cross the parking lot from my window, the same window where I had once wept over Mrs. Donahue's letter, and I noticed that neither of them looked back toward the building before getting into their car. I felt watching them go something I hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph exactly, and not quite forgiveness either, but something adjacent to both, something like the exhausted clarity of a woman who had finally, after 31 years of solving other people's problems, solved one entirely for herself. Martin found me at the window a few minutes later, 2 cups of the bad coffee in hand the way he always did. "Well?" he asked, settling into the chair beside mine. "They came for the money," I said, and left with the truth instead. I think in the long run, the truth might cost them more. Martin smiled the particular smile of a man who has spent 84 years learning to recognize a well-earned ending when he sees one. "You know, Eleanor," he said, "my late wife used to say that some women spend their whole lives being underestimated, and the smart ones learn to let people keep underestimating them for exactly as long as it's useful." I thought about Larkspur Street, the green shutters now painted gray by strangers, the closet door frame with 3 children's heights penciled into the wood, likely painted over now, or simply unnoticed by people who had no reason to look for it. I thought about the strawberry magnet and the mortgage paid down dollar by dollar over 31 years, and the manila folder still sitting in my nightstand drawer, its purpose finally quietly completely fulfilled. I don't know what happens next with Daniel or Patricia or Susan, or even Michael, who at least had the decency to call more often, though not often enough to have earned anything different than what his siblings received. Perhaps they'll come around eventually, once the sting of learning what I'd quietly done has faded into something more like understanding. Perhaps they won't. I find at 75, sitting by a window that finally looks out on something other than a parking lot. Martin arranged that too eventually with Deborah's help, that I no longer need their understanding the way I once did. I gave my children everything I had for 41 years. It turns out the wisest thing I ever did for myself was learning quietly in a bank office 3 months before the hardest year of my life began to keep one thing back. They had no idea what I'd signed. I think in the end, that was exactly as it should have been.